Security risk treatment strategies encompass a range of approaches to manage and reduce potential target threats towards organization assets. In this video discussion, we're going to be unpacking on evaluating and implementing security risk treatment strategies. Welcome to Security Nuggets Podcast, a professional channel that engages on security risk insights and perspectives. And I'm your host, Ashley, a certified security risk consultant. And it's a pleasure to have you joining in this discussion. And without further ado, let's dive right into it. This discussion is actually an extension of the conversation that we had in our previous video of security risk assessment process, aligned with ISO 31000 Standard Guide for Risk Management. And if you missed out on that, kindly check it out so that you can bring yourself up to speed. And I'm going to tag that video conversation in the description box below. Now, if you engaged with that conversation, or if you have a chance to go and have a look at that conversation and bring yourself up to speed, and after engaging in it, you feel you actually need practical assistance in reference to the security risk assessment process application, all right? I got you covered, don't worry, all right? I do have a security risk assessment process ebook, which is a guide that aims to assist security professionals master the art of security risk assessment process application. Now, I do have the ebook on my website link, and I do have the ebook on Amazon through the Kindle version. I am going to link both links in the description box below of this conversation, all right? So check it out and acquire yourself that ebook guide. Now, it's very systematic in the sense that the process has been broken down on a step-by-step basis and expounding on some of the potential tools and techniques that you require in every step, right? And at the end of the ebook, there is a template guide, all right, with actually a case scenario, all right? And through that case scenario, the security risk assessment process has been applied in that case scenario. That template is supposed to help you take the knowledge you've acquired from the ebook and now be able to apply it on real-time case scenario basis. You can be able to contextualize the application of the SRA process with whatever is going on within your organization, depending on where you're working, okay? So instead of you just assimilating the knowledge through the ebook, you have a practical template guide that guides you on the application, okay? From the risk identification to the risk analysis, risk evaluation. So head over to my website shop or the Amazon shopping site and get yourself that, all right? Now, moving on to the discussion at hand of evaluating and implementing security risk treatment strategies, all right? The reason why I decided to do this extension in reference to what we covered in our previous conversation is because, remember, I mentioned that the security risk assessment process is quite broad, all right? And we actually covered it in passing because of time constraint, all right? I decided to have an extension continuation of the risk treatment part in particular to do it justice. And that is what we are going to be covering in this conversation of this discussion at hand, right? And to help us unpack on that conversation, I do have a presentation which I want us to go through. So here we are, evaluating and implementing security risk treatment strategies. So we are going to be looking at what are the approaches that are there that need to be considered by security professionals when they're in this stage of risk treatment, all right? Again, we're also going to have a look at what are the mitigating strategies, all right? How can you mitigate? What are the various ways that you can adopt to mitigate different type of risks within your organization that are targeting those critical assets, okay? Now, we do have three approaches when it comes to security risk mitigation, okay? And the three approaches that need to be considered when you're looking at the most ideal risk mitigation strategies or risk treatment strategies for the target threats that were prioritized in the previous process of risk evaluation, right? You need to consider the three approaches that are there as far as risk mitigation is concerned. The first approach is risk averse. Now, this approach gives organizations the optimal solution to reduce risks to the greatest degree possible. All right? So this means that we are reducing risk to as low as reasonably practical, all right? Either by implementing security controls that could either be from the human element, from the procedures and processes, from the technological and software automations, systems, or from the environmental and architecture design. So whatever controls that you have chosen and they seem ideal, they fit to mitigate against whatever sort of target risks that you have identified in the previous process of risk analysis. And let's just say from the beginning, risk identification, risk analysis, the risk evaluation. So whatever risks that are there towards the organizational assets, then when you take this approach of risk averse, you basically want to reduce them to as low as reasonable, practical, okay? And sometimes this means not even implementing security controls. Sometimes it means doing away with whatever operation or project that was attracting those risks towards those critical assets, okay? So you're taking that risk averse, all right? And the second approach is risk tolerant, okay? And this approach or this option aims to strike a balance between the needs of the security and the organizational constraints, all right, such as funding limitations and et cetera, et cetera. Now, for instance, all right, you're looking at some of the risks that you have evaluated, all right, and you are saying that mitigating against those risks is going to be way too expensive compared to the impact if those risks were to be actualized, okay? So the maths are not making any sense, okay? Because one of the most important security principles that every security professional knows is that when it comes to mitigating, all right, there should be a balance between the cost of mitigating and the risk, okay? Neither should outweigh each other, all right? So the risk should not be greater while the cost is lower. The cost should balance with the extent of the risk, all right? And the cost should not be higher than the potential risk implication, okay? That doesn't make any business sense. So there should be that balance, okay? So you'll find yourself taking this approach of risk tolerance, being risk tolerant, when the risk you're looking at, all right, has very low implication towards the organization, and mitigating it would probably be very expensive. So there's no that balance, all right? And sometimes you can also find yourself tolerating what we call risk residue, all right? So after you take the risk averse approach, when you're mitigating some of the risks, all right, sometimes there's that residual risk that's left. So you've put the controls in place, but still the risk is not guaranteed 100%. Then risk mitigation towards that threat is not 100% guaranteed. Okay? So what's left is the residual risk, the remnant risk, the potential risk, the possibility of what could happen even after those controls have been put in place. That we call that residual risk, all right? Now, you can now choose to take this approach of risk tolerant towards the risk residual. Risk acceptance. This option typically reflects the highest acceptable amount of risk assumed by the organization within the least possible cost, all right? Now, in the process of risk assessment, you will find out that some risks are going to have very minimal impact and their rate of occurrence is going to be very rare. So the probability is going to be very low or very negligible. So if this risk was to actualize, it would have very minimal, if not nil, impact towards the organization's operations, all right? Or organization reputation, etc., etc. Okay? So in this case, you will choose to accept those risks in this phase of evaluating and implementing security risk treatment strategies, okay? So that is another approach that you need to be considering when you're looking at those mitigation strategies, okay? So these three approaches are important. The risk-averse approach, the risk-tolerant approach, and the risk acceptance approach, okay? And moving on, when we are borrowing from ISO 31000, Standard Guide for Risk Management, all right, it actually recommends that when it comes to risk treatment, that we characterize risk treatment as a recurrent process. That means that it really has to be ongoing until we are very satisfied by the end result, all right? Now, in correlation, this is what it also means. It means that we have to assess a risk treatment, all right? And after assessing it, we now decide whether the residual risk levels are tolerable. You know, we have assessed a risk treatment plan, and then we are looking and seeing after we implement the mitigation strategies, all right? When it comes to the residual risk that's being left, is it tolerable? Are we going to tolerate, all right? At the levels tolerable, all right? So you make that decision, okay? If not tolerable, then you have to generate a new risk treatment, okay? And in doing that, you have to then assess the effectiveness of that treatment, okay? So we're not just coming up with security controls as risk treatment and mitigation strategies. We are asking ourselves the question of, to what degree are these strategies going to mitigate the risks that we are focusing within this stage, all right? And after we execute those risk treatment strategies, what do we do with the residual risk? What do we do with the residual risk? And if we find out that the residual risk still poses some sort of negative impact towards the organization, then we go ahead and mitigate those residual risks as well. So we're going to come up with another risk treatment plan, right? So that is what ISO 31000 recommends us to do, all right? I feel like a lot of organizations and most professionals, they don't pay more attention to the residual risk, all right? The residual risk tends to be ignored. it tends to be ignored, right? But we should go a step further. After we have recommended ideal mitigation plans or risk treatment plans, then we should ask ourselves the question of, are the plans we are implementing sufficient to mitigate that risk to a very to as low as reasonably possible? And if that happens and there's still residual risk, what do we do with that residual risk? Are we going to tolerate the residual risk, okay, by not doing anything about it, but documenting it so we are very much aware? Or are we going to acknowledge it and go ahead and recommend risk treatment plans that fit in the approach of risk acceptance? So we are implementing controls that are not expensive. You know, they are not going to cost the organization much. So that is what we need to be cognizant of in this phase, all right? And moving on, let's look at some of the security risk mitigation strategies. We've looked at the approaches, that is the risk-averse approach, the risk-tolerant approach, and the risk acceptance approach. Now let's get into the mitigations. And all these mitigation strategies that we're going to be covering, they either fall in the three approaches. Some strategies will fall under the risk-averse approach, some strategies will fall under the risk tolerance approach, and some will fall under the risk acceptance approach, all right? Now, one of the strategies is risk avoidance, all right? And basically, this strategy entails eliminating the activity or process that poses the risk, all right? So we are basically eliminating the source of the threat. So if the threat is being targeted to critical assets because those critical assets are attractive assets, then we do away with those assets. If the threats are being targeted to the critical assets because of any inherent operation or project or activity within the organization, then we do away with it. Okay? So we are taking that risk avoidance strategy if we go with this, all right? But again, if you're going to take this strategy, that it means that the risk implication is very severe and you want to you just want to avoid having to deal with that risk implication. It's very severe, all right? Or maybe your organization takes a risk-averse approach for so many factors that we mentioned when we are talking about criteria in the previous discussion of risk assessment process, okay? So if you're taking this approach, then the risk impact or the risk implication that the threat has towards you better be very high, all right? Now, in risk reduction, which is the second strategy, in risk reduction, this strategy implements security controls designed to reduce risks to an acceptable level. All right? So this is where we are implementing security controls, whether we are implementing them through personnel or we are implementing them through technological systems or automations, or whether we're implementing them through procedures and policies and processes, or whether we're implementing them through architecture, environmental design, then we are going to implement them with the goal that those controls are going to reduce that risks to a very low degree, that's acceptable to the organization, all right? So we take that risk reduction approach, okay? The third one is risk transfer, which is very common in most organizations, okay? And this strategy entails shifting the responsibility for the risk to another party, all right? Often through insurance or contract. So basically, we are transferring that risk to a third party. We see this a lot in organizations, all right? Sometimes we will transfer the risk to a third-party contract, especially if we're looking for security personnel, security officers, all right? If we want to outsource security officers or guard from a proficient service provider, then we transfer that risk to them and we outsource the service, okay? Sometimes we want to outsource services that have to do with security technology services, okay? So again, we outsource. So we provide the contract of service to a service provider. For instance, we want a company to install for us in an organization an alarm system and also go ahead and provide us with monitoring and backup service. So we have outsourced the service to that provider. So we are transferring that risk to them, okay? And also insurance, when you take insurance to insure your critical assets, you are transferring that risk to an insurance company so that if something happens to your critical assets, the insurance company can be able to compensate you. They can be able to indemnify you, all right? And again, when you're using this risk transfer strategy to mitigate against some of the risks that you're having in your organization and they have been ranked as priority, you need to ask yourself, I have transferred the risk to a third party. Is there a residual risk? And what do I do with the residual risk as an organization? I have seen a lot of organizations deal with it by probably if you were to outsource a security guarding service contract from a service provider, they come with their own insurance liability cover. They have their own contractual cover. In the contracts, they tell you, look, if there's an incident, and something happens to a critical asset that is within our area of service coverage within the contract, then we can be able to compensate you this amount of money, all right? And many of these companies don't compensate much cover. They don't compensate much cover. When you actually look at the cover they are compensating against the actual cost of the asset, it usually doesn't make any sense, okay? So what do you do as an organization? You have to take that initiative of insuring your assets. So as much as you're outsourcing third party contractors to provide you with those security services, you also need to make sure that you are insuring those critical assets, okay? So that's how you deal with the risk residue in this case. That's how you deal with the risk residue. That was just an example scenario. Again, we have the risk mitigation strategy of risk acceptance, okay? This strategy automatically falls under the risk acceptance approach we initially covered, okay? And it basically entails acknowledging the risk and choosing not to take further action, often because the potential impact of likelihood is deemed low, all right? Now, we see a lot of risk residue being accepted, or risks that have very low or negligible impact to as an organization. We accept those risks as an organization, okay? Residual risk, remnant risk that's being left after we have implemented risk controls, and there's that residual risk. We find ourselves accepting it. And we also find ourselves accepting risks that are having quite a low impact towards the organization, all right? And you realize that when it comes to risk evaluation, they don't rank high. They don't rank high, all right? So when you're getting into this phase of evaluating and implementing risk treatment strategies, you already have an idea of some of the risks that will take that approach of risk acceptance, risks that are ranking low, okay? But again, it's very important for you to acknowledge them. There has to be a record. You have to document them, okay? There has to be a record. Because the whole team needs to be on the same page, and the decision makers also need to be in the same page. They need to know, yes, these and these risks are ranked low and they don't warrant mitigating because their impact is too low. It's insignificant, okay? But again, we need to be cognizant of them, all right? Again, you can take the risk acceptance approach for risks that the risk residue you've already mitigated by either risk reduction or risk transfer or whatever mitigation strategy you've used. But again, you find out there's always that minimal leftover risk, that remnant risk, okay? If it poses very minimal or low or insignificant impact towards the organization, you accept it, okay? But if you realize that it poses a threat towards the organization, then you have to look for another strategy, mitigating strategy to deal with that residual risk, okay? And now, when it comes to the other strategy number 5 of risk spreading, this strategy entails spreading and anticipating risk through various options or locations. It may be unwise to store all critical assets in one location. For instance, it is certainly the case that data should be backed up and stored offsite. Okay, that was just one example, so that we can get a glimpse and assimilate better what this strategy is all about. Risk spreading. Basically, you're spreading your assets. You're spreading the risk. Okay. And for the case of data, you don't just store data in one location. Because should something happen to that location, should it be compromised or should there be fire or something, you lose your data as an organization, and it might cost you so much as an organization. The impact of that could be so severe, right? So what do you do as an organization? For instance, you store that in your servers. All right, you have your on-site servers, so you store your data in your servers, but you also make sure that it is backed up somewhere in the cloud, okay? So that if something happens to your servers, you can always recover that data that is backed up in the cloud. But again, you also have to make sure that whatever contingencies or whatever locations you're spreading your critical assets to spread the risk, they also have security measures. They are also secured. All right. Another example that I can use in this option, this strategy of risk spreading, is if you're an organization that is in warehousing, all right, what you do is, instead of storing all your merchandise in one warehouse, you distribute it. So you have warehouse A that is storing this sort of merchandise, and then you have another warehouse somewhere else that is storing another different type of merchandise. Okay, so if something was to happen to either warehouses, then you don't lose everything as an organization. That was just one example, okay? So that's another way of risk spreading. So you're not just putting those critical assets that are attractive in one area, you're spreading them. So by spreading them, what you're doing is you're spreading the risks, okay? And the other one, strategy number 6, is risk concentration. It is the opposite of risk spreading, okay? In risk concentration, what we are doing here is, instead of spreading assets in different locales, we are actually concentrating those assets in one location, okay? So we are concentrating those assets within one location, risk concentration. Now, here's the catch though. If you're going to concentrate your risks if you're going to concentrate your critical assets within one location, you better make sure that you have really hardened those target assets. When I say hardened, I mean that you have really used a very robust security control system to secure where you are storing those assets. All right? You have actually gone via the bunker approach. Now, when I talk of bunker, I can talk of like financial institutions, like banks, okay? Most financial institutions like banks and microfinances, they take this approach where they store these valuable items in form of cash, gold, whatever it is that they are storing on behalf of the clients, diamonds, etc. They store these items in one area. That is why in every bank you walk into, there is a vault. Okay, it is not visible to customers, but we know that at the bank of the, when you get into the bank, past the cashiers that you see at the somewhere behind the action, there's a vault. All right, and those vaults are very bunker mode. The way that they're built is very reinforced. Okay, you cannot just assess the vault by cutting your way through it or drilling your way through it. Like before you get in there, you have to really do so much and have to bypass so many security controls that have been layered, right? So banks use this approach, and it is the risk concentration mitigation strategy, okay, which is the opposite of risk spreading. So depending on the target at hand, all right, you can use this sort of strategy depending on the critical asset that you're trying to protect, okay? The other strategy is substitution, okay? And basically what this means is we are substituting a critical asset and replacing it with an asset that can do the same job but of a lesser value, all right? So instead of having a very attractive and expensive asset within your organization that is target to threat, you still get another asset. You substitute that asset with another asset to do the same function, okay? But because it is of less value, it becomes less attractive to adversaries, all right? So that is what this strategy of substitution really means, okay? For instance, when you're working in organizations, obviously you're given all sorts of devices to support your work, all right? And sometimes we are allowed to carry these devices and go and work at home with them, all right? So instead of organizations investing in very expensive devices, for instance, instead of organizations investing in very expensive Mac tablets, or the most expensive tablets you can think of, or laptops you can think of, they substitute. They get you a laptop that have the same specifications and can do the same job. But what they do is they substitute the model and get you a cheaper model. They get you a cheaper model and reduce the risk, because you don't want to go with that Mac or device at home and lose it, or it's stolen on the way because it's attractive to an adversary. Okay, that is what I mean. But ideally, this is a strategy that can be optimized and leveraged for different sort of assets. Okay, we also see it in some organizations like art galleries. Okay, now when you get into an art gallery, obviously you're expecting that art gallery to have so much expensive artwork, all right? But because organizations know that displaying those original artworks is attracting adversaries, what they do is they put similar artwork. They put the, I don't want to call them counterfeits, but I'm sure there's a better name for it, okay? It's the same artwork, but not the original. The originals have been properly secured and stored somewhere else, all right? That was just an example, but this is definitely a strategy that can be used for so many assets, okay? Because the idea is to substitute. Instead of using an expensive asset that can be is attractive to an adversary, you use a lower value asset that is not attractive to adversary, and it still does the same function, it gets the same job done, all right? So that is what I mean by that, okay? The eighth strategy, obviously the last but not least, is risk retention, okay? This is an alternative to insurance. Risk retention occurs when the organization recognizes the risk but elects to self-insure, right? So basically, when an organization self-insures itself, this means that instead of using an insurance, they actually they compensate for any potential risk losses from their finances, okay? So they go out of pocket, okay? In this case, you can find organizations having some amount of money in their bank account, which they refer to as an emergency fund, all right? Or a miscellaneous fund, okay? So that money is there so that in case of anything, in case of any loss that can be attributed to a risk being actualized, then they can be able to go into their pocket and compensate themselves, or rather recover whatever it is that was stolen or sabotaged or compromised, etc., so that they can get back on their feet and have that business continuity going. Okay, so that is another strategy that can be utilized by organizations. Okay, and you need to be cognizant of it when you're in this space of risk treatment. All right. Now, uh, well, the concept of risk has different dimensions and it is often subjective, as a threat is perceived differently by individuals, organizations, and groups. Organizations and individuals' tolerance levels also play a part in the assessment of risk. Some organizations have low tolerance levels, while others are more robust in their acceptance. I think I mentioned a bit of this when we were talking about the criteria aspect as a very important phase when you're doing the security risk assessment process. Remember, we said before you get to risk identification, you first establish the scope, the context, and the criteria. Let's also expound on risk appetite versus risk tolerance, okay? Upon evaluation of the risk approaches and strategies, the formidable task is to then determine which risks fit within the organization's risk appetite and which require additional controls and action before they are accepted. Some risks will be accepted with no further action necessary. Others will be mitigated, shared with, or transferred to another party, or avoided all together. All right. This speaks again on what we have covered on risk approaches and risk mitigations. Okay. So again, depending on your risk appetite as an organization, it also very much guides you on some of the strategies that you're going to be utilizing when it comes to mitigating. All right. And as a last subtopic in this, what exactly do you need to do in preparing and implementing your risk treatment plans, okay? Because remember, you have now identified the risk approach, the different risk approaches that you're going to embrace, and the risk mitigation strategies that you're going to adopt, all right? When you have all that figured out, now you have to come and put it on a plan. You have to come and document it so that it can be easy to present, all right? Now, the purpose of risk treatment plan is to document how the chosen treatment options will be implemented. Risk treatment plans should capture the following aspects, all right? So these are some of the important aspects that need to be covered in your risk treatment plan, all right? One, you need to have a reason why you're selecting that treatment option, okay? Including the expected benefit and value to be gained, all right? Why are you choosing it? All right, what benefit is it going to reward the organization with, all right? When it comes to this section of who are accountable for approving the plan, you need to recognize the other business functions within your organization, because I want you to believe every organization has its procurement system in place, okay? So you might recommend a treatment plan option, all right? But how are you going to acquire it? what's the approval process going to be like? Do you need to have accounts involved? Do you need to have procurement involved? Do you need to have IT involved? You know, how is your procurement process like? Because all those approval stages have to be gone through. You have to undergo all those approvals depending on how your organization is structured, okay? And also, who is going to be responsible for implementing the plan? You also need to have that well articulated there, because again, it's one thing when you're outsourcing from a third party contract, okay? But if you have to implement internally some of these controls, that means that some of these responsibilities will have to be met by some of your employees and staff across board in the different business functions that you have in your organization. So again, now that needs to be well defined in the treatment plan, okay? And also, what are the proposed actions? Okay, so it's a treatment plan. So it's definitely a treatment plan action. How do we get there? What are the steps that needs to be covered so that we can get there? All right, as well as the resources that are going to be required, including the contingencies. Okay, as much as you have a whole procurement process going on, you also have to have an idea. You need to have a good idea, a projection of what resources would be required in this. You need to have an estimation, a rough idea, all right? And again, what are the performance measures and constraints, and the reporting and monitoring requirements, and also the timing and schedule? Ideally, you're doing this, you know, the way you do a project, it's the same thing you do this, all right? So you have identified the treatment action. So you have to lay the plan. You need to have that treatment action plan that articulates everything that is required for that plan to work effectively and efficiently. All right. So that's it as far as these notes are concerned. I want to reiterate on the issue of project management, and that is a subject that we're also going to have in this sequel discussion of security risk management. You need to have a bit of know-how and knowledge of project management, because the manner at which we are going to be conducting some of these actions really requires some form of organization and structure, right? And considering that as a security professional, you're the one spearheading this, especially if you're someone who's in charge of your security department and function, then you need to have that know-how so that you can be very organized and systematic and well-structured when you're doing this, okay? And we have come to the end of our discussion, all right? As you have seen in our presentation notes, when it comes to treatment plans, it's not just, you know, we're not just thinking of security controls and noting them down and documenting them down. We have a risk and we are like, oh, I feel like a surveillance system is going to be good for this. And that's it. Oh, I feel like having an integrated access control management system is going to be good for mitigating this risk. No, it's beyond that. Right? It's beyond that, because you have to ask yourself, even after you have those controls implemented, are they going to implement that risk to 100% degree, which is not the case in most cases? What do we do with the remnant risks, the residue risk? What do we do with it? All right. Are we going to accept it as an organization, or are we going to, again, go ahead and find ways to reduce it? All right. So it is a more in-depth process, okay? So again, we need to give it that effort, you know, we need to be more intentional with it, all right? So thank you for being part of this discussion. I hope that you have found insights, and I want to thank you for keeping me company. And until our next conversation within the same context of security risk management program, goodbye for now.